Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures, Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Sunny Vanderstar. Today's topic is an international adventure in Glacier and Waterton National Parks. And it will be presented by our fabulous NatHab expedition leader, Jake Richards. Jake, thanks so much for being here today. Please take us away.
All right, thanks, Sunny. Welcome, everybody. So like Sunny said, welcome to the Daily Dose of Nature webinar. Those of you that have seen a few of these know that we do kind of a recurring segment called Know Before You Go, and that's what I'm going to be doing today. And I'll be focusing on our Glacier and Waterton itinerary, which is called the Glacier and Waterton, an International Treasure. So if you've watched the Know Before You Go seminars in the past, you know that this presentation is going to focus more on kind of the nuts and bolts and logistics of this trip. If you want to know more about the wildlife and some of the interpretive side, we have a lot of webinars that we've done throughout the past on some of those topics, or obviously the best way to do it is to come on one of these trips with us. So let's get started. So let me first introduce myself. I'm originally from Vermont. I got a degree, a bachelor's degree in history from Castleton University before becoming a forklift driver for about a decade. And then I went back to school, got a degree in environmental science. And after I finished up that degree, I found out about a program called the graduate program at Teton Science School. So that's when I moved west, got to spend some time up in Jackson Hole. That's kind of where the spark was ignited for wildlife guiding. There's a lot of wildlife guiding up there, and some of my close friends are wildlife guides up there. I ended up finishing my master's degree at Utah State University, focusing on wildlife conservation communication, and that's where I currently live, in Logan, Utah, up here in the Rocky Mountains. I've worked for Natural Habitat Adventures. I'll be calling them NatHab throughout the presentation. I've been working for NatHab for 3 seasons now, and as you can see from my pictures here, I've guided in locations kind of throughout the U.S. National Park system. From the Canyons trip down to South Florida. I've done Yellowstone in summer and winter. They sent me out to Yosemite a couple years ago, and my primary trip is up in Glacier, as you can see from these pictures on the right. So again, I'll be referring to Natural Habitat Adventures as NatHab throughout the presentation. I also might be referring to the trip and the place as Glacier. Even though we do go to a variety of different locations on this trip, that's just part of that entire ecosystem. A brief overview of the presentation that I'm going to be giving today is, first I'm going to talk about why Glacier is such a special place. Then I'm going to be placing it kind of in a geographic context before giving a little bit about the ecological and human history of the place. And then going into some of the more logistical pieces of the trip, as far as the lodging, the transportation, the food, and then I'll go through the schedule, the trip itinerary. It's a 9-day trip, so I'll briefly go through what those days look like. And then I'll be closing by talking about some of the items that you'll want to bring on this trip. And then finally, what we're all most passionate, most excited about, some of the wildlife that we hope to see, that we expect to see while up here. So let me start by getting on my soapbox for a few minutes. That's the fun part about being a guide. You get to do that a lot. So I get asked the question. I get to travel to a lot of cool places, both with NatHab and just in my own time. And I have consistently said that Glacier National Park and this ecosystem is my favorite national park and my favorite place to guide. And the reason I say that is because I'm very privileged that I get to guide in places like Yellowstone and Florida, places that have incredible biodiversity. The wildlife watching in some of those locations is world class. The species there are, phenomenal, endemic species, large carnivores. And I also get to guide in places like the Grand Canyon and other places of the American Southwest, or Yosemite, places where the landscapes are just awe-inspiring and breathtaking. And the reason why I say Glacier is my favorite place to guide is because you get both of those things on this trip. Like you can see from this picture, which was taken on one of our trips last year, you get the wildlife and you also get the landscapes. And it just makes for an incredible place to spend a week for people that are as passionate about nature as we are at NatHab and you all are as guests. So let's talk about where the Waterton Glacier International Peace Park is. And I use that title, Waterton Glacier International Peace Park, because it is a unique place in that these two parks border each other. If you look at that map on the park in the white up there, Glacier National Park is kind of the green, larger area down below. They do abut one another right at the Canadian-United States border. And because of that, they've partnered together to create kind of a unique, whoops, make sure my audio is still working.
We can hear you just fine.
Okay, all right, thank you. So this is a unique place because it's the first international peace park in the world. And what that means is that there are both management and research initiatives that are taken on by both of the parks together. So it's a unique relationship. We talk a little bit more about that over the course of the trip, and that is due to the fact that this whole ecosystem, obviously ecosystems, do not recognize the boundaries or the borders that we put on places. And you can see where we're at. We're up in the northwest corner of Montana, kind of right in the heart of the Rocky Mountain corridor as it comes down through Canada into the United States. So this is all part of what we call the crown of the continent ecosystem. That's kind of the larger term that we use to describe this region that includes both of these parks. And this ecosystem is a landscape that has a very rich ecological and human history. First, I'll touch on the ecological history. So ice and fire, that's kind of an overused cliche thanks to the Game of Thrones series, but it's really an easy way to remember two of the most important factors, things that have shaped this landscape. So if you look at the right, that's Grinnell Glacier. That is still an active glacier that exists in Glacier National Park that we usually can catch sight of on this trip. But Glacier doesn't get its name from the active glaciers that are currently there, which there are still about 25 or 26 active glaciers, depending on how you measure them and depending on time of year. They ebb and flow, as you know, and there are certain size requirements that they need to meet to be considered an active glacier. But Glacier National Park was named that because of the way the landscape was formed by historic glaciers. A lot of the mountains and the valleys were carved by larger continental glaciers, and you see evidence of that everywhere. It's unmistakable. It's why it is the namesake of the park. On the left, you can see evidence of fire. Those standing dead snags were killed off by fire around 2015. This is in the St. Mary Lake area that we get to hike through. And then you can see those beautiful pink wildflowers. That's fireweed. And it gets its name because that's one of the first pioneer species that comes back after a fire. And fire is kind of a very important recurring feature of the landscape, that we have had changing perspectives on over the last century or so. And again, that's another theme that we talk about. But in the American West, and especially in areas like Glacier, fire is very important to a lot of the both flora and fauna that have evolved and adapted to cope with fire and really to benefit from it. So in addition to the ecological history, on this trip, we talk a lot about the human history. And humans have lived on this landscape for thousands of years. There's archaeological evidence that puts them back up to the end of the last Pleistocene, so about as much as 10,000 years ago. The Blackfeet oral tradition puts them there even farther back. Their origin stories basically say they have been here since their people began.
The two primary indigenous groups in the area are the Blackfeet on the eastern side of the park. In fact, the Blackfeet Reservation or the Blackfeet Nation is the eastern border of Glacier National Park, and we do get to spend some time on that reservation, which is a huge privilege, and it's a very important part of this trip. The western side, the primary indigenous group is the Kootenai people, or Kootenai Salish. And so again, we talk a lot about that human history in the park. And if you are looking for some reading before you go on a trip, I highly recommend this book. It's called People Before the Park. And it's a really great book because it does more of a phenological story of the people, meaning it goes through the months of the year. And so if you booked a trip in July, you can read in this book what some of the indigenous groups were doing during that same time of year. So, you know, where they were traveling, the different parts of the area where they would be setting up their villages and camps and what they were eating. So again, it's a great resource and a really interesting look that can really supplement, you know, the trip that you're going to be taking with us. This photo in particular is one of my favorite locations on the trip. It's called Running Eagle Falls, and it was named after a woman who was one of the greatest Blackfeet warriors in their history. And it is said that her vision quest was in the mountains behind this falls, where she got her name Running Eagle. And it's a really fascinating story, and we dig into that among some of the other really fascinating and important human histories of this land. I include this picture because another great privilege that we have on this trip is that we get to spend some time in the Badger 2 Medicine area with a Blackfeet guide who will tell us a little bit more about the story of their people. And I think one big mistake that we often make when we travel to places like this and we talk about the indigenous groups in an area is that we talk about them in the past tense. And, you know, they're still here, they're still in these places, they still use this landscape. And so being able to talk to a Blackfeet guide about his or her experience in this place and you know, kind of what is going on with that group today. Again, a really valuable experience that we have on this trip, and it's really a highlight for me as well as a lot of our guests. So much of the history of the national parks of the American West also revolves around white colonial history. It's also a very significant part of the story that should be told. And in the American West, you can't talk about that part of history without talking about the railroad. And that's a really good segue into talking about our accommodations on this trip, because we do stay in a lot of the historic lodges, which is awesome. They're phenomenal buildings. The architecture is incredible. The history is fascinating. You know, most of them were built in the early 20th century between 1910 and 1925. And they just have some fascinating stories. They were primarily built by the Hills, James Hill and his son Louis Hill, who were the founders of the Great Northern Railway, and they had a very large influence on Glacier National Park and Waterton Lakes National Park becoming parks, because what they were doing is, if these areas were set aside as destinations for people from other parts of the country to come visit, that would allow, you know, basically they would have to take the train out, they would have to use the lodges, and so they set up a lot of the infrastructure in the area that we continue to use today. So in fact, the rail line between St. Paul, Minnesota and Seattle is still called the Empire Builder. And it's called that because, you know, the Hills, Louis Hill in particular, like basically was creating an empire. You know, he founded a lot of the towns and the ranches and you know, the infrastructure between those two locations in a time when that was still the frontier of the American West. So these historic lodges are where we're staying for the majority of the trip. We stay in 4 different lodges throughout the trip, and they are historic for better or for worse. And you know, I try to point that out because, you know, they are beautiful. Their locations, you know, are second to none. They put us right in the heart of the park. But there's certain modern amenities that you shouldn't expect in places like this. So certain things like air conditioning and Wi-Fi. You know, the rooms can be on the smaller side, so we try to build in you know, some of that expectation because you know they're part of that adventure experience that you know NatHab you know does very well, but you know their beauty and their history and their access to the locations where we want to be are unmatched, and so they're worth any of those you know quirks that come from staying in a historic building. And here's a shot of the interior of Glacier Park Lodge, and again, fascinating architecture. We'll get into it. They're beautiful buildings. So let's talk a little bit about transportation on this trip. So rule number 2, everybody gets a window seat. You know, the trips are limited to fewer than 14 people. We take 2 of our safari style Mercedes Sprinter vans, which you can see in these pictures here. You know, the vans, if you've been on a NatHab trip, you know, they're very comfortable, they're very spacious. And another perk is that they're equipped with roof hatches, which come in handy for a lot of our wildlife encounters. Like you can see in this photo, I took this photo on a trip, I think it was last July. And you can see we do get up close and personal with wildlife sometimes, and so those roof hatches really come in handy to get that close experience while still being safe and not disturbing the wildlife. So we have a handful of drives that are, you know, 1 to 1.5 hours. So there's a bit of drive time. We're covering a lot of ground on this trip, but we've designed the trip and the itinerary to kind of minimize some of those longer drives. So about 1 hour to 1.5 hours is about the longest we'll be spending in these vans. We do take a few boats throughout the trip. On most of our itineraries, we'll be taking 4 boats. These are scenic cruises. They're not part of the transportation, like getting from point A to point B. So they are optional if folks are worried about, you know, being on a boat or they've had negative boat experiences in the past. Our transportation is going to be in the vans, but a lot of our activities will be using boats to get to certain trailheads and beautiful scenic areas. So that's rule number 2. Does anybody know rule number 1 on a NatHab trip? You'll never go hungry on a NatHab trip. That's something we say repeatedly throughout our trips. On our Glacier Waterton itinerary, we have a really diverse mix of field meals, like you can see in a couple of these pictures, as well as local restaurants, and we do eat in some of the historic lodges and some of those dining areas. So, and then of course we always have snacks, tons of snacks, all the snacks you could ever want. Again, we really abide by rule number 1, because especially on a trip like this, which is pretty active, we'll talk a little bit about that later in the presentation, but we do a lot of hiking. It's a very active trip, and so staying fueled throughout the trip is important, and it's something we take seriously as well as just being an enjoyable part of traveling. So we do work closely with all of our partners to make sure dietary needs are met, and that's never been an issue on any of our past trips. So if that's a concern of yours, we take care of all of that. So let's get into the itinerary of this trip. So day 1, you're going to fly into a town called Kalispell, Montana. It's a town of about 26,000 people. And from there, one of your expedition leaders, there's 2 of us on each itinerary, we will pick you up at the airport. Again, it's a small airport. It's not going to be logistically complicated to do that pickup, so I won't get into the details right now. But you will be picked up by one of your guides, and we will transport you to our lodging in Whitefish, Montana, which is about 20 minutes up the road. If you do arrive early, some people like to get there a day or 2 early, both to, you know, kind of check out the area or maybe to kind of alleviate some stresses about possible flight delays. If you do, you will be responsible for arranging your own transport to our lodging at the Firebrand in Whitefish. And the Firebrand does have a shuttle, so that's something you can do with the hotel directly. And it's very convenient. And again, it's only about 20 minutes away. So once you get to Whitefish, fun little town. About 8,500 folks live there year round. It's a cute little town, very walkable downtown. If you do get there early or even earlier in the day on day 1, great place to just walk around. You know, there's a cool little swimming spot I can point out to you. It's got a great bookshop, a little co-op market. So again, really neat place to just kind of wander around and get some of that Montana experience. You know, you'll probably see a few cowboy hats as you're walking around. You should probably get one yourself for the trip. It does get sunny, so having a good hat's important. So that evening we do an orientation at the Firebrand where we're staying, and then we'll be driving over to a local restaurant for a welcome dinner, kind of to kick off the trip. And then we get started. We head into the park. Day 2. So this is our first full day in Glacier National Park. Our first activity is going to be to do a scenic float on the Flathead River. And if you go back to the Glacier National Park is kind of U-shaped. The eastern side, or the right-hand side, is bordered by the Blackfeet Indian Reservation. The left side is the North Fork of the Flathead River. And kind of that bottom of the U is the middle fork of the Flathead River. So we're going to be spending some time kind of on that bottom southwestern corner of Glacier National Park. And again, this isn't like a whitewater experience. This is a scenic float. We'll be looking for animals like bald eagles. Sometimes we see some grouse, some other critters along the river, along the banks. And it's just a really beautiful introduction to the ecosystem. And then after doing a picnic lunch that day, we do a ride on one of the red bus. These are scenic tour buses that have been going to the Sun Road since the 30s. And going to the Sun Road is an experience in and of itself. So those of you that are familiar with Glacier have probably seen pictures or videos of it. It's an engineering marvel, was completed in 1932, and really just cuts through. It's the only road that goes from the west side of the park all the way up over the Continental Divide to the east side of the park. And in doing so, it goes up over Logan Pass, which is at about 6,600 feet. It cuts through tunnels, like you can see in the picture here, and it's really an incredible experience. We've kind of modified the itinerary a little bit this year, so we spend more time along that going to the Sun Road corridor, because it is so beautiful and it's such a fun experience, both, you know, just driving up it, but we also have a lot of hikes and other activities planned along that route. So another interesting thing to point out is the west side of the park, which we spend this first full day on, is much more lush and has much different species, especially tree species, plant species, but also a little bit of the wildlife. And that has to do with kind of the topography and its effect on weather patterns. So if you were to look west of Glacier National Park all the way to the coast, there's no major mountain range that's stopping weather patterns coming in from the Pacific Ocean. So when they hit Glacier National Park area, you know, it pushes those weather fronts up over the first real substantial mountains that they've hit. And so they drop a lot of their moisture, a lot of that precipitation falls on the west side before it continues to the east. So another theme that we talk about through the trip that we'll start pointing out here on this first full day is just kind of the differences that we're going to see between the western and the eastern side of the park, which is really fascinating and something I definitely nerd out about. You're going to hear a lot about all that on day 2. So after we go up to Logan Pass on one of those red buses, we're going to come back down and spend the night at one of those historic lodges called Lake McDonald Lodge. All right, day 3. So a lot of big days here. So day 3, we go back up to Logan Pass. Again, that's kind of the height of going to the Sun Road up at 6,600 feet. And we spend quite a bit of time up there. We do a hike, we do a field lunch. The wildflowers are beautiful. We're going to be looking for some mountain goats and bighorn sheep and marmots, and really just beautiful place. We're going to spend some time, and we're going to kind of get our legs moving and do a little hiking up there. From Logan Pass, we're going to drop over the east side of the park. You're going to hear me talk a lot more about the differences between the west and east sides, and we're going to see that firsthand before spending the evening at Many Glacier Hotel, which I think is one of the most beautiful places in the world. This is just a phone picture I took with, you know, no editing. This is the Many Glacier Hotel with Grinnell Point in the background, taken from the parking lot. So Again, beautiful spot. We're going to be spending a couple of nights here. And because we're here 2 nights, that means that day 4, we get to explore this whole area. There's a couple of different glacially carved valleys. We get to go up both of them. We're going to take a couple of boats in the morning to cross these beautiful alpine lakes to get to our trailhead. This is also, I like to point out, this is an opportunity that if you are a very active person, if you want to do a big day hike, there is an opportunity here to do a much larger hike. It takes the entire day, requires a little bit of planning. So that's something that we should discuss early in the trip if you're interested in that. But it does get you up to Upper Grinnell Lake if you're interested in that. Otherwise, we're going to be seeing a lot of that same terrain on some of the other trails that we have in the valley. And throughout the day, as is true with most NatHab trips, we do have some options for shorter hikes and longer hikes and more relaxed days, more active days. So this is kind of a day that we can coordinate between the 2 NatHab guides. We also have support from some other concessionaires in Glacier National Park, so we can kind of meet a lot of the different needs that folks have on these trips. So beautiful area, great spot to spend a whole day. This is, I say, my favorite, my highlight of the trip. I'm going to say that multiple times. I got a lot of highlights. Day 5, we're going to head north up to Waterton Lakes National Park, and we're going to head up to the Prince of Wales Hotel, which is the beautiful building in the photo right here. That's where we stay for our next 2 nights. And boy, can I say this is also a highlight of the trip. So this is prime bear habitat. So this is where, we're in bear country on this entire trip. I'm a big bear guy. One of my things I talk about when I'm guiding is I'm always looking for the toothy critters. I go to Yellowstone for the wolves. I go to Florida for the gators. When I go to Glacier and Waterton, I'm looking for bears. So this is where I'm going to have my binoculars handy, looking for both grizzly and black bears. And we're going to be spending, again, 2 nights here at Prince of Wales, which means we get a full day in the Waterton Lakes region. Here's a beautiful blonde black bear that we saw last year. And we have the support of some local guides from Tamarack Outfitters, local experts that have spent their entire lives, in the ecosystem up here. And so we get a lot of great local knowledge from them. They had a fire there just a few years ago, and it really heavily impacted, both the wildlife, but also the human. It came very close to burning the town of Waterton, and that's part of the story that we get to hear, because again, fire is a theme that comes up and has its pros and cons and has impacted the landscape in a lot of different ways. So we can hike up to Crandall Lake. I usually jump in at Crandall Lake, so I'll be mentioning that to folks. If you have a bathing suit or clothes you don't mind getting wet, this is a great spot to go for a dip in a nice ice cold mountain lake. And then in the evening, we take a boat ride, a beautiful scenic boat ride south on Waterton Lake, all the way back across the US border. Again, beautiful. I can't say enough about Waterton Lakes and this area and this habitat and the mountains that you can see in some of these pictures. All right, so the next day, we're going to do a morning hike in Waterton before starting to make our way back south to the United States. And then we do a little more exploration, taking another one of those red buses up the east side of going to the Sun Road. So again, spending a little bit more time on the going to the Sun Road corridor, just because it's so beautiful, great opportunities for wildlife and other great activities. And then we'll be spending the night at Glacier Park Lodge, which again, we'll be there for 2 nights. And the following day, day 8, which is going to be our last full day together, this is when we get that hike with our Blackfeet Outfitters guide. And again, this is a truly valuable experience. We get to go to a place called the Badger to Medicine area. And it's a very sacred area with a very rich indigenous history. And just the opportunity to be led through this landscape by a member of the Blackfeet Nation is a really incredible experience, and is really kind of a great finale to our trip together, to our last full day together. Our afternoon, we're going to be spending the afternoon taking a boat, the Sinapa, across another beautiful alpine lake. You can see in the picture here, this was in the first week of September last year. They got snow on the mountains, made for some really incredible photos. And then that evening, we'll be having our farewell dinner, a place called Summit Mountain Lodge. And my co-guides and my guests get sick of me talking about the chocolate lava cake there because it's the best dessert on any Nat Hab trip I've gone on. So just saying. Day 9 is our departure day, so we'll kind of be making our way back out of the park, back down to Kalispell for everybody to catch their flights to either go back home or on to their next adventure. All right, that was a lot. So we're kind of rolling into the finish here. I know one of the big questions I get is, what should I pack? So I'm gonna highlight 2 main things that will kind of dictate what you should bring. Number 1 is, this is an active trip. We do a lot of hiking. So bringing good hiking shoes is very important. It's uneven terrain. It's at elevation. You know, sometimes we're actually gaining quite a bit of elevation on some of these hikes. So if you've been on one of my Florida trips, you know, like, calling some of those hikes is a bit of a stretch. They're usually kind of flat. They're usually boardwalks. This is much, much different than that. So having good footwear is very important. This leads me to my next topic. Staying really well hydrated is also incredibly important, not just because of the amount of hiking that we do, but also because we're at elevation. So for folks coming from lower elevations near sea level, they might feel that elevation a little bit depending on where we're hiking. And it's also going to be summertime. It's going to be hot. It's going to be dry. So bringing a water bottle, I would even recommend bringing 2. Nat Hab usually sends you 1, but having a second water bottle is never a bad thing. And also tying into that, having good sun protection is very important. So you can see some of the folks in these pictures, you know, they have sun hats, they have sun shirts, sunscreen, sunglasses. Those things are all very important. We do have sunscreen available, so you don't have to bring that unless you have a certain kind that you prefer. And then optics. Binoculars are optional. A lot of people have kind of their favorite birding binoculars. We do provide binoculars for every guest on every trip, so that's up to you if you'd like to bring your own. And then I would recommend bringing a camera. A lot of folks, you know, phones take great photos, and so that can be your camera, and that's absolutely fine. If you do want to bring another camera, you know, we see some beautiful landscapes. We, you know, hope to see some great wildlife. You know, there's even, you know, wildflowers blooming and waterfalls. And so having a good camera, whether it's your phone or a second camera, is a great idea. Layers are also very important. You can see here, I say you need to bring summer clothes as well as winter clothes. And I'm going to flip to the next slide to kind of mention why. So if you take a look at these temperatures, I'll just give you a second to kind of look at that table. So the average high throughout the summer is in the 70s to 80s, and the average low throughout those same months is in the 40s. So you can see we're going to be looking at temperature swings throughout the course of a day of, you know, 40 degrees or more. So starting in the morning, it's going to be pretty chilly. You're probably going to want a jacket, even, you know, warm hat, warm gloves. But then by the afternoon, we're probably going to be in shorts and t-shirts and, you know, complaining about how hot it is. So being prepared for the day by having, you know, a good layering system is very important. So, and like, you know, I showed in a couple of pictures earlier, you know, snowfall can happen any month of the year. Usually it's in the higher elevations, you know, up above where we're going to be hiking, but it's always a possibility. Photography. So the Glacier Waterton itinerary, we do have photography departures. If you are interested in doing a photography focused trip, this is an excellent place to do a photography trip. You know, there's great opportunities for, you know, wide landscapes, you know, macro photography with wildflowers especially, and then obviously the wildlife is spectacular. Or, you know, you can just get shots of your fellow guide like I'm doing in the bottom right with my buddy Jeremy there. So If you do a photography departure, I would say bring a variety of lenses because again, there's a lot of different amazing subjects that we get to capture on these trips. Even if you're not doing a photography departure, most of the guides are photographers or photo enthusiasts. So, we'll be snapping shots throughout the trip. We love kind of talking about photography and photography techniques. And then, yeah, let's go into the home stretch here and talk about the wildlife. So, obviously, Natural Habitat Adventures is wildlife conservation travel organization. Throughout the trip, we talk extensively about the wildlife. And so I'm just going to briefly go through some pictures of, some photos of animals that we hope to see. I would say expect to see, but, there are no guarantees when it comes to the wildlife. But these are the animals that we would like to see on these trips. And this is why a lot of folks book these trips is, for the black bears, the 2 black bear cubs you can see in this photo. Moose, we see moose quite frequently on these trips, and getting the shot of the moose in the alpine lake is always kind of an objective for some of our folks on the trip. This is a bighorn sheep lamb. So bighorn sheep we see pretty frequently in a few different spots throughout the trip. And then, mule deer are kind of an underrated hero. I think they're a beautiful animal, one I always look for. In different times of the year, they have, different color coats. So again, some other interesting things we'll talk about throughout the trip. Occasionally we get some other predators, such as the fox here, another black bear cub that was on the shores of St. Mary Lake last year. And I just want to say thank you to everybody. I'm looking forward to seeing some of you this summer. And Sunny, I'll turn it over to you.
Jake, thank you so much. That looks like an incredible trip, and you had me at lava cake. You should have just started with that.
It is delicious. It's amazing.
Before we start the Q&A, I just want to remind everyone that they can submit their questions via the questions field in the control panel. So let's start with, can you please remind us of the book that you recommended and the author so that our guests can find that?
Yeah, so the book I recommended is called People Before the Park. The author is Sally Thompson. She's really more of an editor. She basically, this is a collaborative effort between her and a lot of local indigenous groups. So it's written by a lot of leaders of those different groups, but she kind of compiled it and was in charge of the project.
Got it. Can you walk us through the process of crossing the US-Canadian border?
Yeah, great question. Passports are a requirement for sure. I think you can get through with an enhanced driver's license, but passports are recommended for sure. So if you don't have one, I would recommend starting that process early because it can take a while. We also try to use, there's an app on our phones that we will walk you through while on the trip. And this app expedites the border crossing because we can enter a lot of information for like a large group. We'll have probably with the guides and the guests around 15, 16 people crossing the border. So with a group of that size, we can expedite it by using this app to enter things like COVID vaccination information, passport information, and other travel documents. So, but again, that's something that we'll cover on the trip. But if you do want to look into it ahead of time, it might be easier if you get that on your phone ahead of time. But passports are required. And again, we'll be using an app to expedite things.
Excellent. Going to the topic of photography.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the trade-offs for a regular departure and a photography departure?
Yeah. So a photography departure, we have certain permits that allow us a little more freedom to travel throughout the park because our objectives are different than, say a hiking or a wildlife focused trip. it does mean that instead of seeing more of the park, the photography trips tend to focus on like going to some of the photos that I showed in this presentation were taken at Two Medicine Lake, which is in the picture that you're looking at right now, at sunrise. So it requires a lot of earlier mornings. Sometimes we stay up late to get sunset shots. So it kind of shifts the schedule quite a bit. So we spend more time in certain areas, meaning we see less of other areas, if that makes sense. So one of the trade-offs is if you want to see the most of the park, more wildlife, more different things, our regular departure is probably ideal. If you want to focus in and spend more time at a place like Two Medicine at sunrise to get that one shot, that's kind of what those photography departures focus on.
Okay. And on either or both trips, are there opportunities for astrophotography?
Oh, great question. Yeah, so Waterton Glacier is a dark skies park. So yeah, that's something that we could definitely build into the itinerary. I don't think we did it last year too much, and primarily a lot of that had to do with weather and temperatures, but we definitely could build that in. And that's one of the great things about the photography departures is we have a lot of freedom to kind of flex that schedule depending on what the guests would like to do and what the guides have expertise in. So we could definitely do that on a photo departure.
Okay. And one more photography question. Do you recommend a tripod? Would that be worthwhile bringing, or will hikes be faster paced and that would just be a cumbersome thing to carry?
No, I would definitely bring a tripod, especially for shots like this. So this was taken at sunrise in low light conditions. So sometimes you do have to slow down your shutter speed. So no, I would say bring it. We probably won't bring it on every hike that we go on, but having it convenient. So this location is actually not that far from the parking area. So some of these locations we have pretty easy access to, so it's not that much work to use a tripod.
Okay. Switching topics to the physicality of this trip.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us what this trip is rated and a little bit more about, what the hikes are like, how long they
Sure.
are, how fit people should be? Are there alternatives for folks who, on a certain day just feel like, I'm not up for a big hike?
Yeah. So it's rated as moderate. I would say it's moderate plus. It's definitely one of the more hiking heavy departures that we do, or at least that I do here in the national park system. All of our hikes are optional. So, and you saw some of the shots of those beautiful historic lodges. So if you do want to opt out of any hike or any activity, you're not stuck at the Best Western in downtown Fresno. You're right on the shores of Swift Current Lake or Waterton Lake. So I don't want to discourage people from going if they think that some of the hikes might be challenging. Hanging out, reading a book while watching the moose feeding in the water of Swift Current Lake is just as valuable an experience as some of these big hikes that we do. That being said, obviously we're going to see more wildlife while out in the backcountry. So I would say if folks are looking to do this departure, a few months from now, maybe getting out and doing a few hikes now to kind of prepare for that, would be worthwhile because again, a lot of those, personally, this is a personal opinion, but I think the best wildlife encounters are those that happen in the backcountry. As much as I love seeing, the moose from the vehicle, and that's beautiful and amazing, seeing one while you're on trail is kind of another type of experience, and it's one that we pursue on this trip. So if you can get on the hikes, I recommend it, but if not, you're still in a beautiful place.
Great. Can you talk a little bit about the roads? Are they windy? Do people have issues with car sickness? Do you have any tips?
Yeah, so the roads are windy, not gonna lie. Going to the Sun Road, is not super windy, but it does have some switchbacks and it definitely climbs some elevation. That is, we do go into the Sun Road. We basically do the whole thing twice over the course of this itinerary, and that is a necessary part of the trip. That's not an optional activity, because that's how we get from one lodge to the next. That being said, we are prepared for that. We carry ginger chews. We have Dramamine for folks that tend to get car sick. But it is, yeah, I won't lie to you. There are some windy roads, some hill climbs. The roads are usually in pretty good condition, so it's not super bumpy, but we definitely are climbing up and over the mountains. So there are some windy mountain roads.
And can you tell us about the insect situation? Are there biting insects, mosquitoes an issue?
Yeah, there's some. It's usually not like a significant concern. I don't think I've ever worn a bug net on any of my departures. I always have one with me, but not a significant issue. They're up there, but the times that we're out and the places that we go, they don't seem to be a significant issue.
Okay. And can you walk us through a typical day? How early does the day begin? How late do the days conclude?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we're gonna have a couple of days where we do try to get out for sunrise, and so those are going to be early mornings. I'd have to look at the times on some of our past departures, but we don't do sunrise every morning. Most of our boats will be leaving around 8:30 to 9, which means if you want to get up and get breakfast beforehand, I would say, we're getting up around 6:30 ish, and we're getting out 7:30 to 8. So I would say, fairly early, but not as early as some other departures. Especially photo departures, you're really trying to get up and get out before sunrise. Our regular departures for Glacier, probably, that 7 to 8 range is an average day.
Okay. Does Nat have supply hiking poles?
Yep. Yeah, we have trekking poles for every guest and every hike on every itinerary. So yeah,
Okay.
we will have those available. You don't need to pack them unless you have, a favorite pair or anything, but we'll have those available for everybody if you need them.
Okay. Are COVID vaccines required?
That's a great question. I believe NatHab is still requiring that, and I'll have to double check. Things are changing so rapidly. In fact, our COVID protocols just got updated recently. I'd have to double check, but I'm pretty sure to go into Canada, it's still being required. So I'm gonna say yes, but don't quote me, but I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, if folks can connect with their concierge or adventure specialists to confirm the most updated information on that one.
Yeah, I think going into Canada though, the COVID protocols are a little bit stricter on this itinerary. So if you do have questions, I would definitely double check because again, they're going to be a little bit stricter due to the international nature of this trip.
Right. You mentioned an app for the border crossing. Is that something that NatHab takes care of, or do people need to download that app and have things prepared for the crossing?
We go over all of that on the trip. So
Okay.
that's not something you have to do ahead of time. If you'd like to look into it beforehand, you're welcome to. But no, you are not required to do that ahead of time. The guides will take care of that. We'll walk you through the whole process while on trip.
Okay. Let's see. Do you recommend a computer for photo backup?
That's a great question. I bring one. So yes, I usually do. Yeah, yes is the short answer. I know it can be kind of cumbersome to pack and to carry and everything, but it is helpful also, if you want to do any type of editing, any type of storage, backup, I would recommend it.
Okay. Can we switch topics to luggage?
Sure.
What are your recommendations for luggage? Soft-sided, roller?
Yeah, so we recommend everybody has 2 main bags. You basically have a large checked soft-sided bag. That's recommended because we do have an operations specialist on this trip that'll be transporting our luggage between accommodations, and a large soft-sided, if you can find a large soft-sided roller bag. I know a lot of, Eagle Creek and Osprey and other brands make them. Those are kind of the ideal. They're also pretty easy to pack as well. So yeah, a large checked soft-sided roller, that would be ideal. In addition, a decent hiking pack. Your day pack can be like a backpack, but that day pack is also going to be a bit of a hiking pack, so one that's a little sturdier. I might be carrying one kind of like this. It's like a small hiking pack, but it does have a little bit of hip support. So if I'm carrying that extra water or rain gear or camera, I carry quite a bit of gear, so I make sure that day pack is pretty sturdy with a hip belt. But that's my personal preference. But yeah, those are the two main things you'll be packing. You'll have like a large soft-sided check bag and also a nice sturdy day pack that you'll keep with you throughout the trip.
Okay. Well, that is the last question we have time for today. I'll hand it back to you for closing comments.
Well, thanks, Sunny. Like I mentioned a couple times throughout the trip, this is it's truly a special place for a lot of different reasons. The landscape, the wildlife, the human history, and we get to experience all of that very deeply over the course of this trip. We're not just brushing through the human history or kind of like brushing through, the scenic road. We really you get a lot of bang for your buck on this trip, and that's why it's my favorite place to guide. So looking forward to seeing everybody.
Well, thank you again for taking the time to share this itinerary with us. It does look amazing, and I encourage anyone who's going to be joining you this summer to make sure you make some room for that lava cake.
Yeah,
I'm jealous. And the scenery looks amazing too. I want to thank everybody who tuned in. Please join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I'll conclude the webinar. Have a wonderful day, everybody.